What would you do if you were married for 3 long years, but your husband never once reached for your hand, never looked at you as if you mattered, never even whispered your name? This is Clara's story, a young woman who entered a marriage not for love, but for obligation, a contract hidden behind polished walls, where she was treated as little more than a shadow in her own home. Her husband, Jonathan Hayes, a millionaire raised on power and silence, lived as though love was a distraction he could not afford. For 3 years, Clara endured invisibility. But then something shifted. A single gala invitation, a rival's warm smile, a jealous fire awakening in a man who had spent years pretending he felt nothing. Was it too late? Could a love buried under betrayal and lies be reborn? Or was Clara destined to walk away forever, searching for the dignity she deserved? This story will test your heart. It will ask what truly matters: wealth, appearances, or the courage to love honestly. If you believe in second chances, in redemption, in love that costs more than any fortune, then stay with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because you're about to witness a story that will stay with you long after it ends. Clara Whitmore had lived in silence for 3 years. Her mornings began the same way, as if each day were a carbon copy of the one before. She would rise quietly at 6, slip into a pale robe, and pad barefoot down the long hallway of the Hayes estate. The house itself was grand, a sprawling brick mansion on the north side of Chicago, with high ceilings and wide windows that overlooked the frozen lake in winter and the lush green lawns in summer. Yet for Clara, it never felt like home. It felt like a stage where she played the role of Mrs. Hayes, though no one was watching, and no one cared. In the kitchen, she always found breakfast already prepared by the staff: a bowl of oatmeal, a glass of orange juice, sometimes a plate of fresh fruit. She preferred to eat quickly, while the house was still quiet. By 6:15, her husband, Jonathan Hayes, would descend the staircase in his press suit, tie knotted perfectly, shoes polished to a shine, and that was her cue to vanish. Clara had learned the rhythm of his footsteps, the soft tap of leather soles on marble. It was a signal, like the sound of an approaching storm. She would gather her dish, rinse it carefully in the sink, and disappear into the side hallway before he entered. He never stopped her. He never asked why she ate alone. For 3 years, they had barely exchanged 50 words, most of them polite, clipped phrases about schedules or appearances. She used to wonder if he even remembered her voice. Jonathan was not cruel, at least not in the way people might imagine. He did not shout. He did not strike. He simply did not see her. To him, Clara was like a shadow present, necessary, but irrelevant. Their marriage had been arranged, a contract negotiated between families. Her parents, Edward and Margaret Whitmore, had been drowning in debt after poor business investments. The Hayes family, powerful and wealthy, had offered salvation. The price had been Clara. At 24, she had agreed, or rather, she had not been given a choice. Now, at 27, she sometimes caught herself staring at her reflection in the mirror, searching for the girl she once was. She had studied international business at Northwestern, fluent in French and Spanish, once dreaming of working abroad. But dreams had a way of fading when no one asked about them, when no one cared if they existed. Her days were quiet. She read books in the upstairs library, tended a small corner of the garden that the landscapers mostly ignored, and wrote letters to friends she rarely mailed. The staff treated her with distant politeness. Jonathan treated her with nothing at all. There were moments, tiny, almost invisible, when Clara felt the weight of her loneliness pressing so hard against her chest that she struggled to breathe. She would walk along the lakefront path behind the mansion, the Chicago wind biting at her cheeks, and wonder, is this all my life will ever be? She remembered once, early in their marriage, attempting conversation at dinner. The table was long, set with crystal and silver, candles flickering between them. She had asked Jonathan about his day. His answer had been a single word: busy. He had returned to his emails, the glow of his phone reflecting in his blue eyes. After that, she stopped asking. The world outside saw Jonathan Hayes as a remarkable man, a millionaire CEO, brilliant strategist, admired for his discipline. Business magazines called him the young titan of Chicago. But Clara knew another truth. Behind the polished charm was a man made of stone, shaped by his father, Charles, who had built Hayes Global with ruthless ambition. Jonathan had been raised to treat everything, even relationships, as transactions. And so, Clara became another line item in the family ledger. At night, she lay in a bed far too large, the sheets cool and untouched on one side. She would listen for the faint sounds of Jonathan working late in his office, the clink of glass when he poured himself whiskey, the muffled sound of papers shuffling. Sometimes she wished he would open the door, even by accident. Sometimes she wished he would notice her silence. But he never did. 3 years is a long time to live unseen. It changes you. Clara had grown quieter, yes, but also stronger in ways she didn't expect. She learned patience. She learned dignity in solitude. She learned that a woman's worth is not erased just because one man refuses to acknowledge it. Still, there were nights when she pressed her hand against the cold pillow beside her and whispered into the darkness, "Do you even know me, Jonathan? Do you even care?" The silence answered her. Her parents visited occasionally, but conversations were shallow. They looked relieved that she lived in luxury, dressed in fine clothes, and had a roof over her head. They didn't ask about love. Perhaps they didn't want to know. Perhaps they feared the truth that their daughter's marriage was a cage built from their desperation. Clara never blamed them aloud, but deep down, a quiet bitterness had grown roots. As winter turned to spring that year, something in Clara began to shift. She couldn't name it yet, but it was there, an ember buried deep in ashes, a whisper in her heart that said, "Life cannot go on like this forever." The house was too quiet, the days too long, the silence too heavy. Something would have to break, and soon it would. The morning began like all the others. Clara Whitmore sat at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. It was barely 6, the pale gray light of dawn just touching the lake beyond the wide glass doors. She had 15 minutes before Jonathan appeared, 15 minutes to eat her toast, gather her thoughts, and vanish before he came down the stairs. That had been their unspoken rhythm for 3 years, as reliable as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. But that morning, something was different. The sound of footsteps came earlier, steady, confident, echoing on the marble stairs. Clara froze, her fork halfway to her lips. He never came down this early. Never. When Jonathan Hayes entered the kitchen, the air shifted. He wore a navy suit, crisp and immaculate, his tie perfectly aligned. His presence filled the room, not with warmth, but with a weight that always pressed against her chest. She started to rise, preparing to leave quietly, as she always did. But then Clara. Her name, spoken in his low, even voice, made her stop in the doorway. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it. Jonathan hadn't called her by name in months. She turned slowly, her heart thudding. "Yes," she asked, careful to keep her tone steady. He regarded her with those piercing blue eyes, unreadable and distant, as though he were addressing a colleague instead of his wife. "Do you have something appropriate to wear for a gala?" Clara blinked, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "A gala. Friday evening. The Metropolitan Hotel. Hayes Global is hosting international partners. I will need you to attend." His words were clipped, factual, like he was assigning a task to an assistant. Her breath caught in her throat. 3 years of invisibility. And now this public appearance, after years of being hidden away like a family secret. "You want me to go with you?" she asked, her voice faint with disbelief. "Yes." He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, not meeting her eyes. "As my wife, it's important for appearances." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had been invisible for so long, and now suddenly he wanted her by his side, not as a partner, not out of affection, but for appearances. A prop, a decoration? Her tone sharpened. Why now Jonathan finally looked at her, his gaze steady but impersonal. Investors like stability. A married man, accompanied by his wife, conveys strength and reliability. It's business. The word struck her like stones. Business? Wasn't everything always business with him? Clara straightened, a bitter laugh escaping before she could stop it. Of course. After 3 years of silence, you suddenly remember you have a wife because she looks good on your arm in front of investors. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained cold. It's not optional. Friday at 7. Be ready. For a long moment, Clara stood there, her hand gripping the back of a chair, trying to steady herself. Her heart pounded with anger, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of curiosity she couldn't ignore. Why, after all this time, did he care what she looked like? Why choose now to bring her into his world? She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see the storm inside her. Fine, she said quietly, but don't mistake this for obedience. Jonathan, I'll go because I choose to, not because you order me. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw something flicker across his face, something that looked like regret or hesitation. But it vanished so quickly she wondered if she imagined it. Jonathan nodded curtly. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Clara sank into a chair, her hands trembling. 3 years of silence shattered by a single command. She should have felt only anger, but her mind buzzed with questions she couldn't silence. What would it be like to stand beside him in a room full of people, introduced as his wife? Would anyone even believe it? And more importantly, what would it mean for her? That night, Clara stood before her mirror, studying her reflection. She pulled dresses from the closet one by one, holding them against her body, imagining how she would look at his side. She hated herself for caring, but she couldn't help it. For the first time in years, she would step out of the shadows. Beneath the bitterness, a dangerous thought whispered, perhaps this was a beginning. But Clara knew better than to hope. Jonathan Hayes didn't change, not for her, not for anyone. And yet, as she turned off the light, sliding beneath the cold sheets of her empty bed, she realized she couldn't quiet the small, insistent voice in her heart. The voice that asked, what if something is different this time? The night of the gala arrived with an air of unreality for Clara Whitmore. She stood before the tall mirror in her dressing room, the same mirror she had avoided for years. Tonight, she had no choice but to face it. Draped over her shoulders was a navy blue gown, simple but elegant, a piece she had bought long before her marriage when she still imagined attending professional events, not family bargains. She had never worn it. Tonight, it would have to do. Her hair, brushed into soft waves, framed a face that surprised even her. 3 years of silence had not erased her grace, it had only refined it. She applied a touch of makeup, subtle but deliberate. When she stepped back, she hardly recognized herself. At precisely 7, Jonathan appeared in the doorway. He wore a tuxedo, black and flawless, every detail in place. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he said, in that same measured voice, "You look appropriate. Not beautiful, not stunning, appropriate." Clara's lips curved in a faint, bitter smile. High praise, coming from you. His eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, but he said nothing more. He offered his arm. She hesitated, then placed her hand lightly against his sleeve. The fabric was smooth beneath her fingers, but the distance between them felt wider than the room itself. The limousine carried them into downtown Chicago, lights glittering against the night sky. Clara gazed out the window as the city unfolded, streets alive with energy. People rushing, laughter echoing from rooftop bars. For 3 years, she had lived in silence, hidden in a mansion that might as well have been a gilded cage. Now she was being paraded before the world. When the car stopped in front of the Metropolitan Hotel, Clara felt her chest tighten. Flashbulbs exploded as photographers snapped pictures of every guest. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to tremble. Jonathan stepped out first, tall and commanding. Then he turned, offering his hand for a heartbeat. Clara hesitated. Then she placed her gloved hand in his. The cameras clicked. They walked into the grand ballroom together, the chandeliers sparkling overhead, the air humming with conversation and the faint notes of a string quartet. Clara felt like an imposter in a theater she hadn't rehearsed for, but she kept her posture straight, her chin lifted. She might have been unseen in her marriage, but she refused to appear small in public. Mr. Hayes' voices called out as executives, politicians, and socialites gathered. Jonathan greeted them with practiced charm, his hand steady at Clara's back, guiding her as though she were part of the display. "This is my wife, Clara," he said, for the first time in 3 years, acknowledging her presence before others. The words sent a strange ache through her chest. My wife. She smiled politely, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. The men looked at her with interest, the women with curiosity. Some were surprised. Many had never seen her before. She wondered what rumors had filled the silence of her absence. And then, amidst the swirl of introductions, a new voice broke through. "Mr. Hayes," the man said warmly, extending a hand. "Good to see you again. And this must be your wife." Clara turned and found herself looking into the kindest eyes she had seen in years. "Michael Donovan," he said, bowing his head slightly as he took her hand. "It's a pleasure. Mrs. Hayes." Michael was tall, broad-shouldered, with a touch of silver at his temples that only enhanced his distinguished appearance. His suit was impeccably cut, but his demeanor carried no arrogance. Instead, there was something disarming in his smile, something genuine. "The pleasure is mine," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Michael's gaze lingered, not inappropriately, but attentively as if he truly wanted to know her. "I hear you studied languages French and Spanish. If I'm not mistaken," Clara blinked, surprised. Yes, I did." "Magnificent," he said, his voice carrying a hint of admiration. "I've been searching for someone with international expertise, South American markets, in particular. Do you still keep up your skills?" Clara's heart fluttered. No one had asked her about her mind, her work, her passions in years. For a moment, she forgot the crowded room and spoke freely. "I read daily in French, sometimes Spanish. I miss using them professionally." Jonathan's hand tightened slightly at her back. Clara sensed it, but didn't turn. Michael smiled broadly. "We must talk more. Perhaps over dinner next week," before she could answer. Jonathan's voice cut in, cool and sharp. "Clara doesn't work." Michael raised an eyebrow, then looked back at her with a smile full of possibility. What a waste. Then, intelligence and beauty should never be left unused. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in years, someone had seen her not as a decoration, but as a person. She looked at Jonathan, who remained silent, his jaw rigid. Something flickered in his eyes, a flash of something she hadn't seen before. Was it irritation or something deeper, something dangerously close to jealousy? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Clara moved through the ballroom with quiet dignity, answering questions, holding conversations, allowing herself for once to exist fully. Jonathan stayed close, his presence protective, almost possessive. Every time Michael drifted near, Jonathan appeared like a shadow. When the music swelled and couples drifted to the dance floor, Clara caught Jonathan watching her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold, piercing eyes, seemed unsettled, as though he was seeing her not as a shadow, but as a woman. And that realization shook him. The gala stretched on well past midnight, but Jonathan's focus had narrowed to one thing: Michael Donovan's laughter mingling with Clara's soft replies. Jonathan stood across the ballroom, pretending to listen to an executive drone on about quarterly returns. His eyes, however, never strayed from Clara. She was radiant in her navy gown, standing tall and unflinching under the golden chandeliers. and beside her. Michael leaned closer, not inappropriately, but with interest, too much interest. Jonathan clenched his jaw, irritation building with each passing second. He had seen men covet cars, houses, companies. He knew the hunger in Michael's eyes. And now, impossibly, it was directed at her, at his wife. He excused himself abruptly, striding through the crowd until he reached them. Clara was smiling, her eyes lit in a way Jonathan hadn't seen in years. "Michael," Jonathan said, his voice cool. "You've found my wife charming, I see." Michael gave a polite nod. "Exceptionally so. You've been keeping her hidden." "Jonathan? I can't imagine why." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. Clara glanced at him, then looked back at Michael with calm composure. "We were just discussing emerging markets," she said. "Michael seems to think I could be useful." "She's underselling herself," Michael added warmly. "Clara has a sharp mind. She speaks with fluency and precision. It's rare." Jonathan's pulse quickened. Clara's talents, things he had ignored, dismissed, were now illuminated before another man. He hated the way it unsettled him. "I appreciate your interest," Jonathan said sharply. "But Clara has no need for work outside our home." Michael raised an eyebrow, sensing the undercurrent. "If she ever changes her mind, my door is open." He excused himself with a gentleman's bow, leaving Jonathan and Clara standing side by side in the middle of the ballroom. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. For the rest of the night, Jonathan kept her close, barely letting her out of his sight. He introduced her to colleagues, accepted compliments on her grace, but his mind kept replaying Michael's words: sharp mind, fluency, precision, words Jonathan had never bothered to use. By the time they stepped into the limousine, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. The car pulled away from the glittering hotel, the city lights fading into the quiet hum of the streets. Inside, silence pressed down on them. Clara gazed out the window, her posture regal, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Jonathan stared at her reflection in the glass, his chest tight with emotions he had long suppressed. Finally, he broke the silence. "You seemed to enjoy his attention." Clara turned her head slowly. "Michael was kind. He asked about me, not just about you." Jonathan's jaw flexed. He was flirting. She let out a small laugh, bitter and tired. Flirting Jonathan. He was listening. "Do you know how long it's been since someone asked me about my life, my interests, my skills?" Her voice carried no malice, only weary truth, but it pierced him. Jonathan shifted in his seat, restless. "He doesn't understand our marriage." Clara's eyes glistened in the dim light. "Neither do I." The words hung in the air like glass shards. Jonathan inhaled sharply. "You're my wife." "Am I?" she shot back, her voice trembling but firm. "When was the last time you treated me as one? When was the last time you looked at me and saw a woman, not a prop for your image?" The accusation landed hard. Jonathan felt it tear through the armor he had built for years. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He could only stare at her, the woman he had kept at a distance, dismissed, ignored now, blazing with dignity and pain. Clara shook her head softly. 3 years, Jonathan, 3 years of silence. Do you know what that does to a person? To live in the same house with someone and feel invisible. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists against his knees. For once, the commanding CEO had no defense, no prepared speech. His power meant nothing here. Clara turned back toward the window, her profile illuminated by passing streetlights. "Michael may be a stranger," she whispered, "but in one evening, he saw more of me than you have in 3 years." Jonathan closed his eyes, her words cutting deeper than he thought possible. The car rolled on through the night, its engine a low hum beneath the storm that raged silently inside. Jonathan felt the crack in his carefully constructed facade widen, threatening to break him open. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the unbearable truth he had never really seen his wife until another man did. When the limousine finally stopped at the gates of their mansion, neither moved to get out. The silence was suffocating, heavy with everything said and unsaid. Jonathan's voice, when it came, was low, almost broken. "Clara," she turned her gaze on him, eyes sharp and glistening. "I don't know why I can't stand the thought of him near you," he admitted, "but I can't. It makes me furious, jealous, things I never thought I'd feel." For a fleeting second, Clara's expression softened, as though she saw a glimpse of the man beneath the polished exterior. But then she looked away, her resolve hardening again. "You're only jealous because someone else saw what you ignored," she said quietly. "That's not love, Jonathan. That's possession." Her words echoed through him like thunder, shaking walls he hadn't even known existed. The driver opened the door, breaking the moment. Clara stepped out first, her gown flowing behind her as she walked toward the mansion. Jonathan followed, carrying the weight of her truth like a stone lodged in his chest. That night, as the house fell silent around them, Clara lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, across the hall. Jonathan paced alone, her voice replaying in his mind. "When was the last time you saw me as a woman, not a prop, for the first time in his life?" Jonathan Hayes felt powerless, not in business, not in politics, but in the fragile, uncharted territory of the human heart. The morning after the gala, the Whitmore mansion seemed quieter than ever. The grand hall with its marble floors echoed too loudly. The breakfast table felt emptier than usual, though two people sat across from each other. Clara sipped her coffee slowly, her eyes downcast, while Jonathan scanned the newspaper. Though he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes, the silence between them wasn't new. It had been the defining sound of their marriage, but after last night, it carried a new tension, charged and brittle. The chime of Clara's phone broke the stillness. She picked it up, her brows lifting slightly at the name on the screen. Jonathan noticed. "Who is it?" he asked casually, though his voice was taut. "Michael Donovan," she replied, meeting his gaze for the briefest moment before answering the call. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes." Michael's voice was warm even through the speaker. "Forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to thank you for the conversation last night. It was refreshing to meet someone with both grace and intelligence." Clara felt a small, unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest. "That's kind of you. Mr. Donovan." "Michael?" "Please," he corrected smoothly. "I was wondering if you'd join me for dinner this week. Strictly business. There are some ventures in South America I'd like your insight on. I think your expertise would be invaluable." Clara hesitated, glancing up to see Jonathan's eyes locked on her like steel. The invitation hung in the air. Electric. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Wonderful," Michael replied. "I'll have my office send you the details. Good day, Clara." When the call ended, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Jonathan folded the newspaper with deliberate care, placed it on the table, and said in a low, commanding tone, "You're not going?" Clara raised her brows, calm but firm. "Excuse me, you heard me? You're not having dinner with him?" A flicker of anger crossed her face, but her voice was steady. "Why not?" "Because he's not interested in your opinions," Jonathan snapped. "He's interested in you." "And what if he is?" Clara countered. "At least he sees me. At least he listens." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You're my wife." Clara's lips curved in a bitter smile. "On paper. You've reminded me of that enough times." The air between them was scorching, the clash of 3 years of silence finally breaking into fire. Clara stood, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "I'll go if I want to." "Jonathan," she said, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. "And there's nothing you can do about it." She walked away, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors, leaving Jonathan staring at the space she had vacated. For the first time in years, he wasn't the man in control. That night, Jonathan paced his study like a restless animal. The city lights glittered beyond the tall windows, but his eyes kept drifting back to the memory of Michael leaning toward Clara, her face illuminated by interest, her smile genuine. Jealousy. It was a word Jonathan had never permitted himself. He was a man who conquered markets, silenced competitors, bought and sold entire companies. He did not feel jealousy. And yet, here it was, gnawing at him, twisting in his chest like an unfamiliar pain. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts unraveling. Why do I care now? Why does it matter if another man listens to her, talks to her? He had lived 3 years in perfect indifference, or so he told himself. But the image of Clara last night standing tall, eyes glowing with life, haunted him. He had never truly looked at her until someone else did. And now, the thought of losing her even in a way that wasn't really losing her was unbearable. "Damn it," he muttered, pacing faster, his footsteps heavy against the hardwood floor. His empire had never shaken him the way one woman now did. Upstairs, Clara sat at her vanity, brushing her hair slowly. The night was still, the quiet pressing in on her. Her reflection stared back calm, composed, but with eyes that betrayed the storm inside. Michael's invitation replayed in her mind, each word a temptation: dinner, conversation, respect. She closed her eyes, letting the brush fall into her lap. For 3 years she had been a ghost in her own life, existing only in the shadow of Jonathan's silence. And then, in one night, someone had reminded her she was more than that. But loyalty tugged at her heart, too. Despite everything, she was married. Despite the coldness, despite the neglect, the vow still bound her. Could she betray even the hollow shell of her marriage? Her thoughts tangled in painful knots. Do I want Michael's attention because it feels good to be seen, or because I want something more? And if I do, what does that make me? She touched the small gold band on her finger, the symbol of a union that had never been real. Can a woman betray a marriage that never existed in the first place? The question left her unsettled, trembling in the solitude of her room. Downstairs, Jonathan finally sank into the leather chair by the fire, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt stripped of his armor. Not the CEO, not the heir, not the man of power, but a man afraid of losing something he had never bothered to hold. And upstairs, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between the respect offered by another man and the faint, flickering loyalty to a marriage built on silence. Both of them, in their separate rooms, were consumed by the same realization: the ground beneath their marriage had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The restaurant Michael chose was elegant but understated white tablecloths, candlelight, soft music drifting from a grand piano near the bar. It wasn't intimate in the way of lovers, but it was refined, the kind of place where ideas could be shared and futures planned. Clara arrived precisely on time, wearing a deep emerald dress that caught the warm glow of the lamps. As she walked past the murmuring tables, she felt heads turn. For years she had been invisible, but tonight she carried herself with quiet authority. "Clara." Michael rose when he saw her, pulling out her chair with gentlemanly ease. "You look extraordinary." "Thank you," she replied softly, though she felt her cheeks warm. The evening began smoothly. Michael spoke of business ventures in Brazil, mining contracts in Argentina, and the desperate need for cultural fluency in negotiations. Clara answered thoughtfully, her mind awakening like a long, dormant muscle. For once, she wasn't just a wife in name, only she was a woman of knowledge, a professional in her own right. Michael listened with genuine respect, asking questions, nodding at her insights. His attention was steady, not predatory, and Clara found herself relaxing in his company. For the first time in years, she felt seen. And then the air shifted. From the corner of her eye, Clara noticed movement near the entrance. She turned and her heart jolted. Jonathan Hayes stood framed in the doorway, tall, commanding, his blue eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. Her breath caught. He wouldn't, but he did. Jonathan strode across the floor, his polished shoes striking the marble in steady rhythm. Patrons glanced up, conversations faltered, and Clara's stomach knotted with dread. He stopped at their table, his gaze locked on her like a storm about to break. Emily, no, Clara, he corrected himself sharply, his voice colder than the Chicago night. What exactly are you doing here? The room stilled. Michael rose, his tone polite but firm. Jonathan, we're discussing business. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Business over, candlelight and wine. Clara's hands trembled beneath the table, but she lifted her chin. You have no right to be here. I have every right, Jonathan countered, his voice low but edged with fire. You're my wife. The word cut through the air, sharp and possessive. Heads turned from nearby tables, curious whispers rising. Clara felt her face flush not with shame, but with fury. For 3 years, I was invisible to you, she said, her voice carrying farther than she intended. And now, suddenly, you claim me. Jonathan leaned forward, his hands braced against the table. The candlelight flickered in his eyes, wild and unsettled. Because I can't stand watching another man sit where I should have been. Listening to you, laughing with you, wanting you. The words poured out, raw and uncalculated, shocking even himself. Michael cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the tension. Jonathan, perhaps this isn't the place, but Jonathan cut him off, his voice sharp. Stay out of this. Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. Every eye in the restaurant was on them. She could feel the heat of humiliation burning her skin. Do you hear yourself? She demanded, her voice trembling. You never wanted me at your side, never asked about my life, never even looked at me. And now, because another man respects me, suddenly I matter. Jonathan stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. Yes, he admitted, the single word almost a groan. Because it kills me to see you with him. The honesty in his voice was unbearable both to him and to her. For a long, breathless moment, silence hung between them. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears, her emotions a tangle of rage, shame, and something more dangerous, the memory of the way his eyes had softened. Just for an instant, before the storm returned, Michael placed a steadying hand on her arm. Clara, maybe we should. She pulled away gently, her dignity intact even as her heart quaked. I won't be paraded in front of strangers again, she whispered, her voice firm. Not by you, Jonathan, not by anyone. And with that, she gathered her purse, her composure, and walked past them both, her heels clicking against the marble like a drumbeat of defiance. Jonathan remained frozen at the table, his breath ragged, his body tense with emotions he could no longer control. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with murmurs, but all he saw was the empty doorway where Clara had disappeared. Michael exhaled slowly, his eyes following her retreating figure. Then he looked at Jonathan, his tone level. You've ignored her for years. Don't be surprised if she finally learns to live without you. Jonathan said nothing. For the first time in his life, the man who had controlled boardrooms, markets, and fortunes felt utterly powerless. Outside, Clara leaned against the cool stone wall of the building, her breath uneven. Humiliation clung to her, but beneath it pulsed something else, something she didn't dare name. Jonathan's jealousy, his raw, public confession, had shaken her. Not because she wanted to be possessed, but because, for the first time in 3 years, she had glimpsed something dangerous and undeniable in him desire. And it terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. The mansion loomed in silence when Clara returned that night. She didn't wait for the driver to open the door. She swept out on her own, her heels clicking against the stone steps as though each step were an act of defiance. She entered the house, her emerald dress brushing against the polished floors, and went straight upstairs. She didn't stop in the foyer, didn't glance at the portraits that lined the walls, those frozen images of a family built on wealth, appearances, and silence. By the time Jonathan's car arrived, the house was dark except for the faint light spilling from her sitting room. He hesitated outside the door, his hand hovering over the brass handle. For 3 years he had avoided crossing thresholds like this one, preferring distance, control, indifference. But tonight, Indifference was no longer possible. He pushed the door open. Clara was seated by the window, the city lights glowing behind her. She didn't look at him as he entered. Her hands were folded in her lap, calm, but her eyes were sharp when she finally turned. Why, she asked simply. Jonathan blinked. Why? What? Her voice was steady, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of pain. Why now? After 3 years of silence, 3 years of treating me like I was nothing, why do you suddenly care? The question struck like a blade, and Jonathan felt it cut deep. He crossed the room slowly, but stopped short of her chair. I don't know how to explain it, he admitted, his voice raw. But tonight, watching him look at you, listening to you, it did something to me. I've spent 3 years convincing myself you didn't matter, that you were just part of the arrangement. And then suddenly, I couldn't breathe at the thought of another man taking what I'd ignored. Clara's eyes didn't soften. So, this is about possession, then not about me. Jonathan shook his head fiercely. No, it's more than that. It's jealousy, yes, but it's also shame. I saw you tonight, really saw you, and I realized I don't know you at all. I don't even know your favorite color. Clara, I don't know what books you read, what makes you laugh, what you dream about, and that's my failure. His voice cracked on the last word, the facade of the unshakable CEO crumbling before her. Clara stood, facing him, her emerald dress glinting faintly in the lamplight. You're right, you don't know me. And whose fault is that his throat worked? Mine? For a moment, silence filled the room again, heavy with the weight of years. Jonathan raked a hand through his hair, his composure unraveling. I thought distance was safer, he confessed, that if I kept you at arm's length, neither of us would get hurt. I told myself I didn't need love, that business and duty were enough. But now, he stopped, his voice trembling. Now I can't stand the idea of losing you before I even had the chance to know you. Clara's heart clenched, but she refused to let the words sway her too easily. She had lived too long in silence to be softened by sudden passion. You had 3 years, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. 3 years to see me, 3 years to ask, 3 years to care. Her words struck him harder than any blow. He looked at her, his blue eyes shadowed with regret. I know, and I hate myself for it, for the first time since their marriage began. Jonathan looked vulnerable, not powerful, not distant, not the untouchable man she had married, just a man, stripped of pretense, trembling at the possibility of loss. Clara's chest ached with conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take comfort in his sudden honesty. But a voice inside her whispered caution. 3 years of silence cannot be undone in one night of confession. She turned back to the window, her voice softer but no less firm. You've seen me now, but words aren't enough. Jonathan, if you truly want me to believe you, you'll have to prove it, and that takes more than one evening of jealousy. He stepped closer, cautiously, like a man approaching fragile glass. Then give me the chance. Don't shut the door before I can even try. Clara's shoulders tensed, her breath uneven. She wanted to say no, to shield herself from further hurt, but against her will, a seed of something fragile had been planted in her heart. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. I don't know if I can trust you. Not yet. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but his voice was gentle. Then let me earn it. The silence stretched between them, no longer suffocating, but charged with possibility. Clara's eyes softened for the briefest moment before she looked away. This isn't reconciliation, she warned. This is fragile, like glass. One misstep, and it shatters. I understand, Jonathan said, his voice firm, though his chest ached. But I'd rather risk breaking than live another day in silence. Clara closed her eyes, steadying herself. He says he wants me now, but can I believe a man who ignored me for 3 years when she opened them again? Her voice was barely above a whisper. We'll see. Jonathan exhaled, a sound that was half relief, half despair. The night ended with distance still between them, but for the first time, it was no longer silence. It was a fragile beginning, a thread so thin it might break at any moment. And yet, for Jonathan, it was enough to hope. The following week, Clara tried to keep her heart steady. Jonathan's sudden vulnerability had shaken her, but she wasn't ready to believe. She moved through the mansion with her usual quiet dignity, though she couldn't ignore the subtle changes Jonathan, pausing before speaking to her, lingering a little longer at breakfast, watching her as though trying to memorize what he had overlooked for years. Part of her wanted to hope, part of her wanted to trust, but another part whispered, "Be careful." That whisper grew louder the night she stumbled into his office. Jonathan was away at a late meeting, the house unusually still. Clara wandered the halls restlessly, unable to sleep. She stopped at his study, normally locked, but tonight left ajar. A thin stream of light fell across the hallway carpet. For reasons she couldn't explain, she pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of leather and whiskey, papers stacked neatly across the mahogany desk. She shouldn't have entered yet. Something drew her in. Her eyes caught on a folder left half open, its edges covered in Jonathan's precise handwriting. Curiosity pulled stronger than caution. She slid the folder toward her, fingers trembling as she scanned the title page. Merger Agreement, Hayes Global and Whitmore Holdings. Her breath caught. She turned the pages, eyes racing over the lines. Her father's signature, her mother's, Charles Hayes, and there Jonathan's, bold and confident. The words blurred as she read. Terms, assets, debt forgiveness. And then her name? Marriage between Jonathan Hayes and Clara Whitmore shall constitute binding assurance of merger stability. The room spun. She sank into the leather chair, clutching the papers. It hadn't been fate. It hadn't even been duty. It was a deal. She was the collateral. A sob tore from her chest before she could stop it. For 3 years she had endured silence, telling herself at least the marriage was hers, however hollow. But now even that illusion shattered. She hadn't been a wife. She had been a bargaining chip, sold to save her parents' pride and Jonathan's empire. Her hands shook as she gathered the papers, pressing them to her chest like they were shards of glass. The weight of betrayal was crushing. The door opened. Clara Jonathan's voice was cautious. He froze when he saw her at his desk, the folder clutched in her trembling hands. She rose slowly, her eyes blazing. "What is this?" His face drained of color. He took a step forward. "Clara." She held up the papers, her voice breaking. "Answer me. What is this?" Jonathan closed his eyes, pain etching across his features. It was part of the arrangement, years ago, before us. Her laugh was bitter, strangled. Before us, there was no us. There was only this contract. She slapped the papers against his chest, her body shaking. "You didn't marry me. You bought me. Clara, listen." "No." Her voice rose, echoing off the high ceilings. "For 3 years I thought I was invisible because you didn't care. But the truth is worse, isn't it? I was never a wife at all. I was an asset, a clause, a piece of paper." Jonathan reached for her, but she stepped back, her eyes glistening with fury. "Everything you've said these past days, every word, was it just another performance, another tactic to keep your deal intact?" His throat worked, but words failed him. "It's not like that. I swear to you, Clara, not anymore. Not anymore." Her voice broke. "Do you hear yourself? You admit it was true. You admit I was nothing to you but leverage." Tears blurred her vision, hot and relentless. She couldn't breathe, couldn't stand the walls of the study closing in around her. With trembling hands, she dropped the folder to the floor, pages scattered like fallen leaves. Jonathan stepped forward again, desperate. "Clara, please!" But she shook her head violently. "No, you don't get to plead. You don't get to explain away 3 years of lies. She turned, her gown brushing the floor as she strode toward the door. Where are you going? Jonathan's voice cracked with panic. Away, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I won't live in a house built on deception. I won't live with a man who sees me as currency. Clara. Her hand gripped the doorknob. She paused, her back to him. Her voice was quiet, but sharp as glass. You said you wanted to earn my trust. You just destroyed the last piece of it. And then, she was gone. Jonathan stood frozen in the wreckage of papers, his chest heaving. The silence of the mansion pressed in on him, heavier than ever before. For 3 years he had ignored her presence. Now, for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of her absence. Clara left with nothing but her purse and coat, her heels clicking on the marble like echoes of finality. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The night air was cold against her tear-streaked face, but it was nothing compared to the chill of betrayal lodged in her heart. As the cab pulled away from the estate, Clara pressed her forehead against the glass. Chicago's lights blurred through her tears, but she felt something stronger than sorrow resolve. For the first time since her wedding day, Clara was free of the lies that bound her, and she intended to stay that way. The mansion had never been louder in its silence. Jonathan stood in the grand foyer, staring at the front doors long after Clara had left. Her footsteps echoed in his mind, fading into nothing. The air felt different without her presence, colder, emptier, as though the very walls knew she was gone. For 3 years, he had lived comfortably in this silence. Now it was unbearable. He wandered through the house, every room a reminder of her absence. The dining table where she once sat in silence now looked cavernous. The library smelled faintly of her perfume, the cushions still bearing the subtle indent of where she read for hours. Even the garden beyond the glass doors seemed lifeless without her tending hands. He poured himself a drink in the study, his hands trembling as the amber liquid sloshed into the glass. He took a long swallow, but it did nothing to steady him. Instead, memories flooded in, not of Clara, but of his father. Charles Hayes had never believed in love. Love is weakness, he used to say, his voice sharp as steel, a distraction for men who can't control themselves. Jonathan had grown up in a house where affection was rationed, where success was the only currency worth anything. Every meal was a negotiation, every smile conditional, every conversation a lesson in strategy. As a boy, Jonathan had once handed his father a crayon drawing himself and his parents holding hands in front of a sunlit home. Charles had looked at it, expression flat, and said, "Art doesn't earn dividends. Stop wasting your time." He had thrown it into the fireplace. Jonathan had watched it burn, the colors curling into ash. From then on, he had learned emotions were liabilities, attachments, distractions. People were assets, or they were nothing. And so, when his father proposed the marriage to Clara, Jonathan hadn't questioned it. She was beautiful, educated, suitable for appearances. Most importantly, she secured a deal that saved both families. He had agreed without hesitation. It was practical. It was business. But somewhere in those 3 silent years, the business had turned into something else, something he hadn't recognized until it was too late. Now, the silence of the mansion mocked him, every corner whispering what he had lost. He set the glass down, pressing his palms against the desk, his reflection in the dark window staring back with hollow eyes. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Hayes began to wonder if his father had been wrong. Across the city, Clara settled into a modest hotel room. The space was small, just a queen bed, a worn dresser, and a narrow window overlooking the bustle of Chicago's streets. The carpet was faded, the air smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals, and the hum of traffic seeped through thin walls. But to Clara, it felt like freedom. She set her suitcase on the bed and unpacked slowly a few dresses, her books, the simple toiletries she'd managed to grab in her rush. No servants to arrange them, no grand closets, no gilded mirrors, just her own hands, her own choices. For the first time in years, she breathed without feeling watched or ignored. She made herself tea with the small kettle by the window, the steam curling up into the cool night air. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, she held the warm mug in her hands and let the heat seep into her. It was a far cry from the mansion's opulence, but she didn't miss it. Not for a second. Clara opened her journal, its pages blank since her marriage began. She touched the pen to the paper, hesitant at first, then steady as the words poured out. I am more than a contract. I am more than a wife in name only. I am Clara Whitmore, and I will not disappear again. Tears blurred her vision, but these tears felt different, cleansing, not breaking. For the first time, she wasn't mourning what she lacked. She was reclaiming what was hers, her voice, her dignity, her life. She closed the journal, her hands steady. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing with certainty: she would no longer be invisible. Back at the mansion, Jonathan sat in his father's old leather chair, haunted by Clara's last words. You said you wanted to earn my trust. You just destroyed the last piece of it. The fire crackled in the hearth, but he felt no warmth. His empire stretched beyond those walls: contracts, markets, wealth, but none of it filled the emptiness inside. For the first time in his life, Jonathan questioned the foundation of everything he had built. If people were not assets, if love was not weakness, then what had he been living for? He leaned forward, his head in his hands, the echo of his father's voice clashing with Clara's. One voice said power was everything. The other said power without love was nothing. Jonathan didn't yet know which was true, but for the first time, he wanted to find out. And for the first time, he realized he might lose everything before he did. The boardroom at Hayes Global was designed to impress: long mahogany table, high-backed leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city stretched beneath it like a kingdom, gleaming towers against the October sky. But to Jonathan Hayes, it all felt like a prison. He stood at the head of the table, papers stacked in front of him, his reflection mirrored in the glass wall. Around him sat the board of directors, men and women accustomed to his cool efficiency, his relentless pursuit of profit. And at the far end, Charles Hayes, his father, his shadow, the architect of his beliefs. Jonathan, Charles said, voice clipped. You called this emergency meeting. Explain yourself. Jonathan inhaled, steadying the tremor in his chest. I've decided to dissolve the merger with Whitmore Holdings. Effective immediately. The room erupted. Murmurs, gasps, the scrape of chairs as board members leaned forward in disbelief. One of the lawyers stammered, Mr. Hayes, with respect. That merger secured over $20 million in assets. Dissolving it would be catastrophic. Do it, Jonathan cut in. His tone carried no hesitation. Prepare the documents, return the company to David and Margaret Whitmore. All shares, all holdings. They keep the cash infusion, no conditions. The room went still. Charles slowly rose to his feet, his eyes narrowing into steel. Jonathan, he said, his voice quiet but lethal. Are you out of your mind? Jonathan met his gaze. No. For the first time in my life, I'm thinking clearly. Charles laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Clearly, you're throwing away millions. You're undermining years of negotiations. Do you have any idea how this will look to investors? To the market, Jonathan's jaw tightened. I don't care. You don't care. Charles slammed his hand on the table. This company is your legacy, our name, and you're willing to torch it over a woman who don't. Jonathan's voice cracked like a whip. The entire room froze. Charles straightened, his lips curling. Over a woman who walked out on you, who doesn't even want your name. That's your justification. Jonathan took a step forward, his hands braced against the table. His voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the room. Clara is worth more than every dollar in this company, more than every contract, every skyscraper, every empire you ever dreamed of. She is worth more than all of it. A hush fell. Even the lawyers shifted uncomfortably, unused to hearing emotion in Jonathan's voice. Charles studied him with something like disgust. "You sound pathetic. Weak. I raised you better." Jonathan shook his head. "No, you raised me to be like you. A man who treats people like numbers, who thinks power is measured in profits, who believes love is a liability. And look where it got us: an empire. Yes, but an empty one. A family built on transactions instead of trust. I won't live that way anymore." His father's face darkened. "You'd throw away the Hayes name, I'd throw away everything," Jonathan said, his chest heaving. "If it means showing Clara that she comes first, that she's not a deal, not a contract, not an accessory. She's my wife, and for once, I intend to act like it." For a long moment, Charles said nothing. The silence pressed against the walls, heavy as stone. Then Charles sneered. "You're a fool." Jonathan straightened, his expression calm. "Maybe, but I'd rather be a fool with love than a king without it." He gathered the papers, sliding them across the table toward the lawyers. "Draw it up. Make it official. The Whitmores get their company back by the end of the week." The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared argue further. Jonathan's authority was absolute, even when his father's wrath simmered beside him. Charles sat back down slowly, his hands clasped on the table. "You'll regret this. She'll never come back to you. And when she doesn't, you'll have lost her and the company both." Jonathan looked him in the eye, steady and unflinching. "Then at least I'll know I chose her over the company, and that's a choice I can live with." Later that night, Jonathan returned to the mansion. The house was still empty, its silence heavy, but something inside him had shifted. He walked through the halls with purpose, the echo of his footsteps no longer haunting, but resolute. In the study, he sat down at his father's old desk. He remembered being a boy, watching Charles negotiate deals late into the night, never once coming upstairs to read him a story or ask about his day. That desk had been a throne of control, a fortress of power. Now it would become an altar of sacrifice. Jonathan picked up a pen, signing the initial dissolution orders with a steady hand. His signature, bold and final, marked not just the end of a business arrangement, but the end of the man he had been. When he set the pen down, he whispered into the empty room, "This is for you, Clara. Even if you never know, across the city." Clara lay awake in her hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. She had no idea what Jonathan was doing that very moment. No idea that he was unraveling millions of dollars for her sake. To her, Jonathan Hayes was still the man who had lied, who had hidden the contract, who had made her feel like nothing more than a pawn. She didn't know that. For the first time in his life, he had chosen differently. But she would, soon. The hotel room was dim, the blinds drawn against the pale winter morning. Clara sat curled on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around her stomach, as another wave of nausea passed through her. For days she had brushed it off: bad food, stress, lack of sleep, but the truth was undeniable now. Her hands trembled as she opened the small paper bag from the pharmacy. 3 identical boxes lay inside, each holding the answer she both dreaded and longed for. She set them on the bathroom counter, the bright fluorescent light humming above her. One by one, she took the tests, her breath shallow, her body tense. Then she waited the longest minutes of her life. The second hand on her watch ticked loudly, each beat like a drum in her ears. When the results appeared, all 3 bore the same word: positive. Clara sank to the tiled floor, the stick slipping from her hand as tears blurred her vision. She pressed her palm to her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs rising from her chest. She was going to have a baby. Jonathan's baby. The shock rippled through her body. She thought of the mansion, the silence, the years of being invisible. She thought of the night she left, of Jonathan's hollow promises, of the betrayal she had uncovered in those contracts. And now, life new, fragile, undeniable life was growing inside her. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach. "Can I raise a child? With a man I don't trust?" She whispered into the quiet bathroom. The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Part of her heart still ached for him, the Jonathan who, in rare unguarded moments, had looked at her like she was more than a duty. The Jonathan who had begun to unravel at the thought of losing her. But memories of coldness and lies still overshadowed those moments, leaving her uncertain. She pictured raising the child alone. The thought terrified her, yet it also brought a strange sense of freedom. For once, the child would not be a contract, not a bargaining chip, not a transaction. The child would be hers to love, hers to protect, hers to raise with the dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. And yet, there was Jonathan, the father of her child, a man broken by his own upbringing, molded by his father's cold hands, yet somehow beginning to crack open. Could she deny him the chance to be a father? Could she deny herself the chance to see whether love could be reborn from betrayal? That evening, Clara sat by the window of her hotel room, the city lights flickering below. The hum of traffic felt distant, like another world she no longer belonged to. Her journal lay open on her lap, words scrawled across the page in shaky handwriting. "I am carrying a life that did not ask for this chaos. I must choose carefully. I cannot let history repeat itself. But what if there is more to Jonathan than I believed? What if he is capable of love, of change? Am I willing to risk my heart again for myself, for this child?" Her pen hovered over the paper. Then she wrote, "I need to see him one last time." The next morning, Clara dialed his number. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She had avoided calling for over a week, ignoring every message, silencing every ring. But this time, when his voice answered, her heart clenched. Clara. His tone carried both surprise and something else, desperation barely hidden. She swallowed hard. "Jonathan, we need to talk." A pause. Then, steady, "Yes." Where Clara looked around the small hotel room, its walls too close, too impersonal. She couldn't face this revelation in such a place. At the house. Your house. Tonight. There was another pause, then a quiet breath on the other end. "I'll be there." She hung up quickly, her heart pounding, her throat dry. That night, Clara dressed simply, a navy coat over her shoulders, her scarf wrapped tight against the cold. As she approached the mansion, her steps slowed. The house loomed ahead, tall and elegant, but she no longer felt intimidated by its size. It wasn't home, not yet, maybe not ever. She stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and faint cologne stirring memories she had tried to bury. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floor as she entered the living room. Jonathan was already there, standing near the fireplace, his hands in his pockets. He looked thinner, wearier, as though the days had stripped him of his usual armor. When he saw her, something like relief flickered in his eyes. "Clara," he said softly. She didn't answer right away. She took in the room, the paintings, the firelight, the silence that had once suffocated her. Then she met his gaze, her own steady, though her heart trembled. "There's something you need to know," she said. Inside, Jonathan braced himself. He had spent nights pacing the halls, reliving her last words, wondering how to undo the wreckage he had caused. He had given up millions, returned the Whitmore business, faced his father's scorn, all in the hope of proving to Clara that she was worth more than the empire itself. But she didn't know that yet. And now, she stood before him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name: fear, determination, sorrow, maybe all at once. "What is it?" he asked. Clara hesitated, her hands clutching the folds of her coat. She felt the weight of her secret pressing against her, fragile but unyielding. This truth would change everything. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "I'm pregnant, Jonathan." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, stretching like an eternity. Jonathan's face went pale, his lips parted, but no words came. Pregnant. The word echoed in both their minds. For Clara. It was the truth she had carried alone for days. For Jonathan. It was a revelation that shattered the last of his defenses. And for both, it was the beginning of a choice that neither could avoid. The fire crackled low in the hearth, filling the mansion's living room with a faint, uneven glow. Clara stood near the window, her coat still wrapped tightly around her shoulders, as if it were armor. Jonathan remained by the fireplace, his posture tense, as though the words she had just spoken had struck him like a physical blow. "You're pregnant." His voice was hoarse, quiet, like he was afraid to say the word too loudly. Clara nodded once, her hand instinctively brushing her stomach. "Yes." Jonathan took a step forward, then stopped himself, his hands half raised. His blue eyes flickered with a storm of emotions. Shock, fear, wonder. "My God," he whispered, "a child, our child." Clara's throat tightened. "Don't say our like it was something we planned together. I didn't even know if I should tell you. I almost didn't." The bitterness in her voice cut through the air. Jonathan flinched, but he didn't look away. "You did tell me," he said softly. "And that means something. Clara, please, let me prove to you that it matters to me." Clara turned sharply, her coat swaying. "Prove you've had 3 years to prove something. Instead, you kept me in the dark while my marriage, my life, was written into a business contract." Her voice cracked, rising despite her effort to stay calm. "I wasn't a wife to you, Jonathan. I was a clause, a merger condition, a pawn on your father's chessboard." Her words landed with precision, reopening the wound he had inflicted. Jonathan lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening. For once, he didn't try to deny it. "You're right," he admitted. "That's what it was in the beginning. A deal, an arrangement." He looked up, his voice gaining strength. "But that's not what it is anymore. Not for me." Clara's laugh was bitter. "And why should I believe that?" Jonathan stepped closer, his voice steady but raw. "Because I ended it. The merger, the deal, all of it, it's gone." Clara blinked, her anger faltering. "What are you talking about?" "I gave the Whitmore Company back to your parents," he said. "Every share, every dollar, every condition. They own it again, free and clear. The lawyers are finalizing it this week." Clara stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit. Her pulse raced. "You what?" "I dissolved the agreement," Jonathan repeated, his voice calm now. "It cost millions. My father thinks I've lost my mind. Maybe I have, but I had to. Because you were right. Clara, as long as that contract existed, you would never know if I saw you as my wife or just part of the deal. I needed to prove to you and to myself that you are worth more than any empire." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The image of her parents' kitchen table flashed in her mind, her mother's trembling hands. Her father's guilt as he told her about the debt. The contract had haunted her ever since, a constant reminder that her marriage was purchased, not chosen, and now Jonathan had undone it. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the nearest armchair, pressing her hands to her temples. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Jonathan whispered, stepping closer. His voice was gentler now, almost pleading. "Just know that it's real. What I feel for you, it's not about business anymore. It hasn't been for a long time." Clara looked up at him, her eyes wet but fierce. "Then why now? Why wait until everything fell apart? Why wait until another man noticed me? Until I was carrying your child?" Jonathan's shoulders sagged, his mask slipping. "Because I was blind," he confessed. "Because I was raised to believe love was weakness, and I was too proud to admit I was wrong. And then, when I saw Michael Donovan looking at you, saw how easily he noticed everything I had ignored for years, I realized I couldn't lose you. Not to him, not to anyone." He knelt in front of her now, his hand hovering close but not touching. His eyes searched hers, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "Clara," I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I'm asking anyway. Not for me, for us, for this child. Her hand trembled as she pressed it against her stomach, feeling the weight of his words. The room seemed to spin around her anger, her longing, her exhaustion, her hope colliding all at once. She closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. You broke me, Jonathan. For 3 years, you broke me piece by piece until I thought there was nothing left. And now, she opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. Now you expect me to believe you've changed. Jonathan's voice cracked. Not expect, just hope. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire popped. The clock ticked softly. The silence heavy with unspoken truths. Then Clara's hand slipped from her stomach and fell into his. The touch was hesitant, fragile, but real. Jonathan clasped it gently, as though afraid she might vanish if he held too tightly. This child deserves better than what we've been, Clara whispered. Better than lies, better than contracts, better than silence. Jonathan nodded, his grip steady. Then let's give them better, whatever it takes, for the first time in years. Clara felt a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a beginning. And in that fragile beginning, surrounded by the ghosts of their past and the firelight of an uncertain future, Jonathan Hayes and Clara Whitmore chose to try. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing like faint stars in the hearth. Clara and Jonathan still sat in the living room, their hands joined as though the fragile thread between them might snap if they let go. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't like the old days, the heavy, suffocating quiet of indifference. This silence was alive, pulsing with something fragile and new. Clara looked down at their clasped hands, her voice breaking the stillness. Jonathan, I don't know if I can forget the years we lost. Jonathan's thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, steady and deliberate. I don't want you to forget. I want you to remember, because remembering is what will hold me accountable. No more lies, Clara, no more contracts, no more hidden agendas. From this moment, only truth. Her eyes flickered to his, searching. She saw the weariness etched into his face, but beneath it, there was something she hadn't seen before. Surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but of pride. You talk about truth, she said softly. But how do I know you won't disappear behind your walls again? Jonathan leaned closer, his voice low but steady. Because I don't want walls anymore. They kept me safe. Yes, but they also kept me empty. Clara, when you walked out, I finally understood what my father never did. Love isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes all the rest worth anything. I can lose this house, this company, everything, but I can't lose you. The words hung in the air, trembling with sincerity. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She wanted to resist, to hold on to her anger, her mistrust. But the weight of his confession broke something open inside her, something she had guarded for so long. She let out a shaky breath. You hurt me more than I thought I could bear. And yet, I still love you? Jonathan's eyes closed as though the words themselves were a balm. When he opened them again, they glistened. Say it again. Her lips trembled, but she whispered, I love you. He exhaled, a sound that was half sob, half laugh, as if years of restraint had finally shattered. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he would never let go. Clara pressed her face into his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. It was the first time in 3 years she had felt his warmth without walls between them. Hours seemed to pass in minutes as they talked, really talked for the first time. Clara told him about the nights she had felt invisible, about the ache of being unseen. Jonathan listened, his hand never leaving hers, his eyes never drifting. He told her about his father, about the emptiness of a childhood built on transactions, about the fear that had kept him from reaching for her. It wasn't you I couldn't face, he confessed. It was myself. Every time I looked at you, I saw the man I should have been and wasn't. That's why I stayed silent. Cowardice. Clara shook her head gently. Cowardice is staying silent forever. Speaking now, that's courage. Jonathan kissed the back of her hand, a gesture so simple yet so raw that her chest tightened. You're the only one who ever saw me, even when I refused to see you. Her heart softened. For the first time, she believed him. When the clock chimed midnight, Jonathan rose and extended his hand. Clara, he said softly, come upstairs with me. Not because I want to claim you, not because of duty, but because I want to begin our life together, truly together, for the first time. Clara hesitated, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Jonathan, everything is different now. I'm carrying more than just myself. He knelt before her, his hand gently covering hers. Then let me take care of both of you, tonight, tomorrow, always. Her throat tightened, but she nodded slowly. She placed her hand in his, and he guided her upstairs. The master bedroom felt different than she remembered. Once, it had seemed like a fortress, his fortress, shut off from her, tonight, with him standing beside her. It felt like uncharted ground, a space waiting to be filled with something real. Jonathan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His hand lingered, reverent. You're so beautiful, he murmured. Clara's lips quivered. You've never said that before. I should have said it 1,000 times, he whispered. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the silence. Their lips met, tentative at first, then deepening with a hunger neither had allowed themselves to feel. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't obligation. It was the beginning of something neither had dared to believe possible love without condition. Later, as they lay side by side beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp, Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Jonathan's arm was draped around her, protective yet gentle, as though he were afraid she might dissolve into the night. For once, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. She felt chosen. Promise me something, she whispered. Anything. No more lies. No more contracts. Jonathan tilted her chin upward, his gaze unwavering. I promise. From now on, Clara, only love, only us. She believed him. For the first time, she truly believed him. And as she drifted to sleep in his arms, Clara knew that tonight marked not the end of their story, but its true beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything Clara had ever known in her marriage. She woke one morning to the scent of coffee drifting into the bedroom. At first, she thought it was the staff, but when she stepped into the kitchen, she found Jonathan standing awkwardly at the stove, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly mussed. A frying pan hissed in front of him. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, a sheepish smile tugging at his lips. Don't laugh. It's supposed to be eggs. Clara's brows lifted in surprise. Jonathan Hayes, polished CEO, master of boardrooms, looked almost vulnerable, standing there with a spatula in his hand. She tilted her head, a smile breaking through despite herself. You've never cooked in your life. First time for everything, he said, sliding the somewhat lopsided eggs onto a plate. Sit, please. It wasn't the meal that mattered. It was the effort. Clara sat, watching him pour her coffee, placed the plate before her as if it were a banquet. The gesture was clumsy, imperfect, and more genuine than anything she'd seen in 3 years. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's changes came in small, steady ways. He began joining her for breakfast instead of disappearing behind the morning paper. He asked her questions not about mergers or market forecasts, but about her thoughts, her dreams, her day. And he listened. Sometimes they sat in silence, but it was a companionable silence, no longer the heavy void of avoidance. One evening, she found him in the library, not reading corporate reports, but thumbing through one of her novels. He looked up, almost embarrassed. I wanted to know what you've been reading all this time. Clara's chest warmed. It wasn't grand gestures, but these moments simple, human, vulnerable that began to soften her doubts. For Jonathan, The shift was not easy. Vulnerability was foreign territory. More than once, he stumbled, his temper flaring when business pressures overwhelmed him. But instead of retreating into silence, he forced himself to speak. "I'm afraid," he admitted one night as they walked in the garden. His voice was quiet, but steady. "Afraid I'll fall back into the man I was, that I'll disappoint you again." Clara squeezed his hand. "The only way you'll disappoint me is if you stop trying. Perfection isn't what I need. Jonathan, honesty is." He nodded, her words sinking deep, anchoring him in ways numbers and contracts never could. Clara, too, began to step into her own life again. She had always dreamed of using her skills in languages and international relations, and now she had the freedom to choose. With quiet determination, she began consulting small at first, taking on translation and cultural advisement projects. Jonathan surprised her by not only supporting her, but celebrating her. When she showed him her first contract, signed under her own name, his smile was genuine. "Clara, this is incredible." She studied him carefully, waiting for a flicker of condescension, of control, but it never came. Instead, he took her hand, kissing her knuckles with reverence. "I want you to have your own world, your own voice. I'll never stand in the way of that again." The words soothed something deep inside her. For years, she had been nothing but an ornament, a silent shadow. Now, she was herself again, and Jonathan was not threatened by it, but proud. Their intimacy grew slowly, tenderly. Not just in the bedroom, but in everyday moments, his hand brushing hers as they read side by side, her laughter bubbling out when he tried unsuccessfully to bake bread, the way he leaned against the kitchen counter just to watch her hum while she cooked. These were the stitches of a new fabric, woven not of power or contracts, but of respect. One evening, as they sat together in the garden under the glow of lanterns, Clara spoke softly. "Do you know why I left, Jonathan? Truly left?" He nodded, his expression somber. "Because I treated you like property, like something to display or control, not someone to honor." And now she asked, her voice steady. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her palm. "Now I know that love isn't ownership. It's partnership. It's listening. It's showing up every day, even in the smallest ways." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she leaned into his shoulder, resting her head there. "That's all I ever wanted." The weeks turned into months, their lives quietly transforming. The staff noticed first how Jonathan lingered at breakfast, how Clara's laughter echoed through the halls, how the master bedroom was no longer cold and untouched but alive with warmth. The city noticed next Clara beside Jonathan at public events, not as a silent accessory, but as an equal, her opinion sought, her presence commanding respect. For the first time, she was introduced not simply as Mrs. Hayes, but as Clara Whitmore Hayes, consultant, partner, wife. But for Clara and Jonathan, the true change wasn't in appearances. It was in the quiet mornings, the shared glances, the conversations that stretched into the night. It was in the way Jonathan no longer measured success in numbers, but in the curve of her smile. One morning, as sunlight streamed into the dining room, Jonathan placed a hand over Clara's as they sat with their coffee. His voice was soft but resolute. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Clara smiled faintly, her hand resting on her growing belly. "You earned it, and you're still earning it." He nodded, his eyes steady. "And I always will." They sat together in the morning light, the silence between them no longer empty but full of trust being rebuilt, of respect being restored, of love taking root in soil that had once been barren. 6 months later, spring returned to Chicago. The air was softer now, the snow melted away, and the gardens outside the Hayes estate bloomed with tulips and roses. For Clara, the season mirrored her own transformation. Her belly curved gently beneath her pale blue dress, the life inside her growing stronger with each passing day. Where once she had felt invisible, now she glowed, Not because of wealth or appearances, but because love, real, hard-earned, fragile yet fierce, had finally taken root in her life. Jonathan stood beside her in the sunlit garden, his hand steady at her back. He wore no tuxedo this time, no armor of polished perfection, just a simple gray suit, his hair tousled by the breeze. For once, he looked not like a man performing for the world, but like a man at peace. The guest list was small, a handful of close friends, Clara's parents, even a few of the household staff who had quietly watched the transformation of their marriage. Gone were the glittering chandeliers, the paparazzi, the endless speeches. Today was not about empire. It was about two people standing before each other with nothing between them but truth. As the ceremony began, Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She remembered the first wedding, the coldness in Jonathan's eyes, the weight of the contract unspoken between them. She remembered the silence, the loneliness, the years of feeling like a ghost in her own home. But she also remembered the night she left, the moment she discovered the contract, the anguish, the betrayal, and then Jonathan's choice to undo it all, his vulnerability, his sacrifice, his daily steps toward becoming the man she had longed for. Those memories didn't vanish. They stood here with her, woven into her heart. But now, they no longer defined her. They had become the soil from which something stronger had grown. When it was time to speak their vows, Jonathan turned toward her, his hands trembling slightly as he held hers. His voice was low, but it carried across the garden, clear and certain. "Clara," he said, "the first time I married you, I gave you a contract. I gave you silence. I gave you less than you deserved. Today, I give you only my heart. No more lies, no more walls, no more contracts, just me, imperfect but honest, yours in every way. From this day forward, I vow to love you not as an obligation, not as an arrangement, but as the woman who saved me." Clara's throat tightened. She blinked back tears as she looked into his eyes that once had been cold, now lit with sincerity. When her turn came, her voice trembled but grew stronger with each word. "Jonathan, the first time I married you, I was afraid. I didn't know what my life would become, but I knew it wasn't mine anymore. I was lost in silence, in shadows, invisible in my own home. But now I stand here by choice. I stand here because I've seen your heart, because you've shown me change not in words but in actions. I vow to walk beside you, not behind you. I vow to raise this child with you in love, not fear, and I vow to never let silence steal from us again." Her hand slipped to her belly as she spoke the last words, a quiet reminder of the new life they were promising to nurture together. The officiant smiled, his voice warm. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife not by contract, but by choice." Jonathan didn't wait for the cue. He pulled Clara into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that drew cheers and soft laughter from the small gathering. For once, he didn't care who was watching. When they pulled apart, Clara pressed her forehead to his, her tears shining in the sunlight. "This feels real," she whispered. Jonathan's smile was quiet, reverent, "because it is." After the ceremony, they walked hand in hand through the garden. The tulips swayed in the breeze, and Clara leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. Her parents approached, her mother's eyes glistening. "You look radiant, darling." Clara smiled softly. "For the first time, I feel radiant." Her father shook Jonathan's hand, his grip firm. "Take care of her. Take care of them both." Jonathan's eyes softened as he looked at Clara's belly, then back at her father. "With everything I am." As the sun dipped lower, Jonathan led Clara to a quiet bench beneath the blossoming cherry tree. The laughter of their guests drifted faintly across the lawn, but here it was, just the two of them. He took her hands again, his voice low. "Clara, I can't erase the past. I can't change the years I stole from us. But I can promise you this. I'll spend the rest of my life giving you better." Clara leaned in, her lips brushing his softly. "And I'll spend the rest of mine believing you can." They sat there as twilight fell, the garden bathed in gold, and for the first time since the day they married, Clara felt that the story of her life was no longer written in contracts or silence. It was written in love, messy, imperfect, but true. The renewal of their vows wasn't just a ceremony, it was closure, a line drawn between the painful past and the fragile, hopeful future. And as Jonathan wrapped his arm around her, holding both her and the child they would soon meet, Clara knew that this time, this love they had chosen together. A year had passed since Jonathan and Clara stood in the garden to renew their vows. Spring had turned to summer, summer to winter, and life had quietly reshaped itself into something neither of them could have imagined during those long, cold years of silence. They now shared a small but bustling consulting firm in downtown Chicago, their names side by side on the glass door, Hayes and Whitmore Consulting. Clara specialized in emerging markets and cross-cultural negotiations, her sharp mind and linguistic talents opening doors in South America and Europe. Jonathan, once the distant CEO who lived behind walls of power, now thrived in strategy and client relations, surprising even himself with how much he enjoyed listening rather than commanding. The office was modest compared to the towering headquarters of Hayes Global, but it was theirs built not on contracts or mergers, but on choice, sweat, and trust. On a quiet Friday afternoon, the office buzz faded as their small team left for the weekend. Clara lingered at her desk, papers spread before her, when Jonathan appeared in the doorway, their baby son resting against his chest. Edward Whitmore Hayes had inherited his father's piercing blue eyes, but carried his mother's gentle smile. At 6 months old, he had already mastered the art of melting every heart that looked his way. Jonathan leaned against the doorframe, his tie loosened, his voice soft. "He wouldn't nap unless I brought him to see you. Seems he already knows who keeps this place running." Clara chuckled, her heart swelling at the sight of them. She closed her laptop and crossed the room, brushing her hand over David's fine hair before kissing her son's forehead. "Smart boy," she murmured. Jonathan shifted the baby into her arms, watching as David's tiny hand curled around her finger. Smart and stubborn, like his mother. Clara looked up at him, raising an eyebrow, and patient, like his father when he wants to be. They sat together on the worn leather sofa by the window, the city skyline glowing gold in the late afternoon light. For a while, neither spoke. Clara rocked David gently, her thoughts drifting. It was astonishing, she realized, how far they had come. The mansion once filled with silence had been replaced by an office alive with purpose, by a home filled with laughter and midnight feedings, by a marriage that was real at last. She thought of the girl she had been, the invisible wife, the pawn in a contract, and felt a surge of compassion for her. That girl had been strong, even in her loneliness, strong enough to walk away, strong enough to demand the truth. Without her courage, this moment would not exist. Jonathan seemed to be thinking the same. He reached over, taking Clara's free hand in his. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked quietly. "The way it used to be," Clara nodded. "Sometimes." The silence. The hurt. She looked down at David, asleep now against her chest. "But then I look at him, and I realize that everything we went through, it brought us here." Jonathan's voice thickened. "I nearly lost you. More than once. And I deserve to." He turned his gaze toward the skyline, his jaw tightening. "But you gave me a chance. And I'll never stop being grateful for that." Clara squeezed his hand. "You earned it, Jonathan, not with money, not with power, but with change, with honesty. That's what saved us." The sun dipped lower, the office bathed in amber light. Jonathan leaned closer, his voice low, almost reverent. "Do you know what I see when I look at you now?" Clara smiled faintly. "What? The woman who taught me how to love, who showed me that a marriage isn't about ownership or appearances. It's about partnership, about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard." Her throat tightened with emotion. She kissed David's head, then leaned into Jonathan's shoulder. "And do you know what I see? He shook his head slightly. A man who proved that people can change, who gave up millions just to show me I mattered more than money, who became not just my husband, but my partner in everything, even this little firm of ours. Jonathan laughed softly, brushing a stray hair from her face. Especially this little firm. As the city lights flickered on outside, Clara whispered the words she had once been too afraid to believe. We built something real. Jonathan, finally. Yes, he said, kissing the crown of her head. This is our real marriage. Not the one on paper, the one in our hearts, in our home, in the way we raise him. Clara closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of Jonathan's breathing, the soft sound of their son's sleep. For the first time in years, she felt no fear of tomorrow. The past was behind them. The future was theirs to shape. And so, after 3 long years of silence, betrayal, and painful truths, Clara and Jonathan discovered that love cannot be forced by contracts or bought with fortunes. It must be chosen, day after day, in honesty and in tenderness. Their story reminds us that even the deepest wounds can heal, that people can change, and that true love built on respect, trust, and truth is worth more than all the money in the world. When Jonathan and Clara held their son in their arms, they knew. This was their beginning. This was their real marriage. Clara and Jonathan's story is not just about marriage, it is about the choices we make, the truths we hide, and the courage it takes to change. For 3 years, Clara lived in silence, invisible in her own home. Her strength came not from being loud, but from enduring with dignity until she finally demanded honesty. Jonathan, raised in a world of contracts and cold ambition, had to learn that wealth means nothing when love is absent. Only when he chose to give up millions did he discover the real treasure waiting in front of him. The lesson is simple, yet profound love cannot be built on silence, control, or obligation. It must be chosen every single day with kindness, with respect, with honesty. No amount of success, money, or reputation can replace the warmth of a shared meal, the comfort of trust, or the joy of being truly seen by someone you love. For those of us who have lived through decades of change, this story is a reminder. It is never too late to open our hearts, to speak the words left unsaid, and to choose love over pride. Because in the end, love built on truth is the only wealth that endures. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to Clara and Jonathan's journey. We truly hope their story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of love, honesty, and second chances. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life stories that inspire, heal, and stay with you long after they end. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Until then, take care, cherish the people you love, and remember, every day is a chance to begin again.